Welcome to week 3, and I hope that this course is challenging your thinking. I hope it is stretching you in new areas when it comes to New Testament issues and apologetics. In this lesson, we want to talk about historical accuracy of the New Testament, significantly and primarily with the Gospels. If you've never thought of apologetics, especially when it comes to the New Testament as a historical discipline, I hope that this lesson will change your mind on that. The historical background and accuracy of the New Testament is one of the strongest arguments that we have for the truth of what the New Testament reports regarding Jesus' life and death, resurrection, all that the Gospels record. So I want to talk for a little while about historical accuracy and what we would call historicity, which simply means historical accuracy. So one of the most common objections of Christianity is that objection that there are historical errors in the Bible. Many people who question or reject the Bible as true do so because they find the recorded events in the Bible either to be unbelievable because they're miraculous or mythical. That is, they don't believe that they really happened in history. Now, many of the people that make these objections simply don't know what they're talking about, but they can come across as authoritative and come across as though they know what they're talking about. The problem is when you talk to real historians and read the writings of real historians, they have much greater confidence in the historical accuracy of the Bible, especially when it comes to the New Testament and especially when it comes to the Gospels. In other words, critics of the New Testament typically don't know much about history. I find that when I engage a local skeptic or atheist here in Lancaster. He has all kinds of objections to the events that take place in the Gospels, but he doesn't realize that historians generally accept them at face value because of the abiding historical accuracy of the New Testament. So unlike many sacred writings from world religions, the Bible is full of references to historical events and people and places. And many of these references are attested to in other writings, historical records, and archaeological finds. Again, one of the strengths of the Gospels is that they record so many details. And recent work by Cambridge scholar Peter Williams shows that unless those Gospel accounts were written by people who lived during that time in that particular area of the New Testament, Palestine, those things simply could not have been recorded accurately. And the reason he writes his little book, Can We Trust the Gospels, is because many critics would say the Gospels were written hundreds of years later, far away from the areas that are contained in the Gospels. And he says this simply could not be the case. Let's take geography, for example. Many of the small, tiny, intricate geographical details that are shared in the Gospels are things that could not have been known by anyone outside of that area. We tend to not understand this because today we can go on Google Maps, we can research an area, we can look up details and read many accounts of geographical features. But think about in the first century. There was no atlas of the Bible lands. There was no detailed description of many of the things contained in the Gospel accounts. And Peter Williams at Cambridge would say that there's no way to have known these facts unless those who wrote the Gospels actually lived in that time and knew some of the details. I don't know about you, but that's incredibly encouraging when it comes to the accuracy of the New Testament. We are not placing our faith and hope in perhaps a mythical account of Jesus' life that could be true. We can rest with confidence that when it comes to a discipline as objective as history is and as objective as history can get, it supports the reliability of what we see. So what is history? History is simply past events that are the object of study. In other words, when we talk about history, we're not talking about everything that happened in the ancient world or even in the recent past. History doesn't bear out all the details of human life all around the world since the beginning of time. Rather, we get to study what has been preserved, either by eyewitness testimony, which we'll talk about in a later video, or historical artifacts, or writings that communicate what previous eyewitnesses have said. And that's true of any past event. We must depend on these things in order to know what happened. And again, the Bible has such numerous support from outside itself that we do not have to worry about its reliability. And not only do we have external evidence, such as the testimony of non-biblical writers, the gospel accounts themselves are considered by many historians to be primary sources. Some critics would like to say, well, show me outside the Bible where this is confirmed. And they miss the point that real historians look to the Bible because of the details in it that are often way more detailed than you would find outside of Scripture itself. Here's a couple of principles. When we ask the question, how do we know the New Testament is accurate, we look at basic principles of historicity. That is, how does any historian study past events, especially in the ancient world? There are some general principles, and when you apply those to Scripture and the reliability of the Gospels, I think you'll see that we have quite a bit of support on our side. First of all, when historians look at ancient evidence, they prefer early evidence over later contributions. What we mean by early evidence is the closer that the report is, or the closer that the historical artifacts are to the time that you're studying, the more reliable they tend to be. In other words, historians would prefer an account that takes place within the lifetime of the person that they're reporting about, or shortly thereafter, than they would a document that was written hundreds of years later that didn't actually take place in that area or close to that time. So early evidence is strongly preferred to later contributions. One example of early testimony about the resurrection, for example, is the list that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15 about all those who saw Jesus after his resurrection. Many critical scholars who do not profess Christ believe this information came from earlier sources dating from the late 30s, that is, less than 10 years after Jesus' resurrection. This is important because if this information was incorrect, most of the people mentioned in this list would have still been alive and could have disputed it. However, we have no evidence that anyone ever disputed Paul's claim. Second, eyewitness testimony by those who actually participated in the events described is highly regarded as reliable. The reason for this is that the witnesses testify from the inside of an event, not simply as casual or accidental observers. In other words, some critics, and I've heard unbelievers challenge in this way, say things like, well, you can't trust what the Gospels say. They believed in Jesus, so of course they're going to write things about him, such as his miracles or the things that he wrote. But think about that for a moment. If we only had history written by people who didn't believe the events that they were reporting about, what would we have? Well, we wouldn't have history at all. No one writes about historical events that they don't believe happened, unless they're writing about a conspiracy theory. But very clearly, the accounts of Jesus in the Gospels is not a conspiracy theory. Too many connections to historical events, too many specifics leave historians believing that this is historically accurate. There's a couple other factors that increase the reliability of a historical event. First of all, multiple independent sources increase the historical reliability of an account. Paul Meyer, a historian, says this: many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, while two or three sources in agreement generally render the fact unimpeachable. You think about what we have in the Gospels. We have at least 2 or 3 Gospels that report on most events. And on some of the key events regarding Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, we have 4 Gospel accounts. Now, again, critics sometimes look at the Gospel and say, well, that's just one account. That doesn't count as multiple. But again, professional historians say, no, these 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John as the 4th Gospel, all count as individual testimony to the events of Christ. In other words, there is more testimony about several facts regarding Jesus than we have about most facts in the ancient world, and that lends to reliability. A second factor is the principle of embarrassment, or what's often called negative report or surprise. That is when a gospel includes stories that reveal a failure of the author or someone with whom the author has a friend relationship, the story is considered credible. The reason is because if the gospel is being fabricated and made up as a propaganda piece, as is often supposed by critics, such stories would not be included that would diminish the reputation of the person. A common example is the somewhat negative portrayal of Peter in the Gospel of Mark. Tradition tells us that Peter is the one who recounted the material to Mark, who wrote his gospel for those living under threat of persecution. But what's interesting is in Mark's gospel, he makes no attempt to clean up Peter's image. Again, think with me. If Peter is trying to get Mark to write his gospel in a way that makes Peter look good, Mark failed miserably. It's Mark that records Jesus calling Peter Satan when Peter tried to rebuke Jesus. It's Mark who tells us that Peter failed to stay awake and pray when Jesus was agonizing in Gethsemane before his crucifixion. And it's Mark who memorializes Peter's denial that he even knew Jesus. The point is that if the Gospels were written to propagate a myth about Jesus and about the disciples as his designated heirs, they would have portrayed Jesus' followers in a much better light. And we could go on and on with this point. Think about things such as the fact that Jesus' own family thought that he had lost his mind, or when his own brothers, including James, who eventually becomes the pastor of the early Christian church in Jerusalem, didn't believe his claims, as John 7:5 reports. Additionally, throughout the Gospel of John, we're told that the disciples' belief in Jesus developed only over time. John himself did not fully believe until he saw the empty tomb, we're told in John 20 and verse 8. In other words, in all these instances, there are details in the Gospels that you would simply not include if you were making them up. And when historians look at that, they indicate that such details point to the fact that the Gospels are historically accurate. We could go on in this video, but this video is just to introduce you to our lesson, to give you an idea of how important historicity is to our claims about the Christian faith, to our confidence that what we hold in our hands when we hold the Bible is reliable and true. And if we would learn the facts of historical reliability, we would find that we have many ways to answer those critics who want to question the reliability of Scripture. So my hope for you is as you do the reading, as you work through the assignments in this lesson, that you will see the power and the strength of the historical accuracy of the New Testament, specifically the Gospels. And I pray that this would give you much ammunition in the battle of ideas when it comes to defending the faith.